would like to think that I am improved as an entertainer, and I like to get the rapport with an audience, because it's a give and take thing. If you can do that, it works.
When Elvis Presley broke into the music scene, he didn't just shake up the charts, he rattled the foundation of an entire industry. To millions of fans, he was electric, magnetic, unstoppable. But to the old guard, the polished crooners and primetime icons who'd reigned before him, he was a disruption. And for Elvis, that disapproval cut deeper than most people ever realized. Let's start with Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, a legend in his own right. Sinatra had already built an empire by the time Elvis showed up swinging his hips and stirring up teenage chaos. While fans were screaming for Elvis, Sinatra stood watching from the sidelines, unimpressed. He didn't get the appeal. He didn't want to. In the late 50s, Sinatra made headlines for calling rock and roll, quote, "the most brutal, ugly, degenerate, vicious form of expression it has been my displeasure to hear." That's not a subtle jab, it's a slap across the face of an entire generation. And while he never named Elvis directly, it was obvious who the comment was aimed at. Who else embodied that wild, unpredictable spirit better than Presley? Now imagine being a 22-year-old Elvis at the peak of your rise and hearing that the man you once admired thinks your entire career is trash. It stung. He grew up listening to Sinatra, respected his vocal style, even looked up to him. That kind of insult doesn't just bruise your ego, it chips away at your confidence. But here's what made it even more complicated. Elvis never fired back. Not really. In a press interview, he said, "I admire Frank Sinatra. He's a great artist, but I don't think rock and roll is harmful. It's just a way for kids to have fun." Classic Elvis. Humble, polite, but inside, that wound stayed open. Years later, the two shared a stage on Sinatra's TV special. They sang each other's songs, they smiled for the cameras, and it looked for a moment like all was forgiven. But behind the scenes, insiders say Elvis still felt looked down on. He wanted to be seen as a peer. Sinatra treated him like a novelty act. That's the thing with icons, they don't like to share the throne. And Sinatra wasn't the only one. Next up, Robert Goulet. Now, Goulet wasn't exactly a household rival. He wasn't touring arenas or stirring up youth revolutions. He was a Broadway guy, known for his rich voice and formal stage presence. In other words, everything Elvis wasn't. Their tension might have flown under the radar if not for one moment, a story that would become legendary in Elvis lore. One night in the 60s, Elvis was watching TV in his living room when Goulet came on screen, singing a slow, dramatic ballad as Goulet often did. Elvis stared for a second, then pulled out a gun and shot the TV. No, really, blew a hole straight through the screen. Was it serious anger? Was he just fooling around? Depends who you ask. Elvis's friends later said he couldn't stand Goulet's style. Too stiff, too self-important. But some believed that gunshot meant more. It wasn't about Goulet personally, it was about what he represented. A music world that still treated rock as second class. That dismissed Elvis as a fad, not a force. And Elvis hated that. He knew he had talent. He believed in his voice. But critics kept saying guys like Goulet were the real artists. That kind of doubt doesn't just make you angry, it makes you insecure. Then there was Liberace, the original Vegas showman. Rhinestones, feathers, pianos that spun in circles. Liberace owned the Vegas stage long before Elvis ever thought of returning. And when Elvis made his comeback in 1969, guess who was still performing across the street? Now, to be fair, there wasn't open hostility between them. Liberace actually liked Elvis. He gave him advice early in his career, even suggested he dress flashier to wow the crowd, which, ironically, Elvis eventually did. Those iconic jumpsuits, straight out of Liberace's playbook. But Elvis didn't like being coached, especially not by someone who seemed more costume than substance. He respected the performance value, but deep down he wanted to be seen as more than glitter and gyrations. And that's what this was really about. Liberace was the face of old Vegas, lounge acts, elegance, spectacle over soul. Elvis wanted to tear that down. He wasn't there to blend in, he was there to take over. And the fact that Liberace still packed houses while Elvis had to fight to reclaim his spotlight, that bothered him. Each of these men, Sinatra, Goulet, Liberace, stood for something that Elvis never felt accepted by. They weren't just fellow performers, they were symbols of the respect he never quite earned. Sure, he had the screaming fans, the record sales, the stadiums full of people losing their minds, but what he wanted, what he craved, was recognition from the elite. The crooners, the critics, the suits behind the curtain, and they never gave it to him. That's why the rivalries stuck, not because he hated their music, but because they reminded him of what he was constantly denied. Validation. Being the king sounds glamorous, but sometimes it's the loneliest job in the world. By the mid-1960s, Elvis Presley was still the king, but the kingdom was changing. New voices were rising, new sounds were sweeping the charts. And for Elvis, that meant more than competition. It meant the uncomfortable realization that his reign wasn't guaranteed. Let's talk about the Beatles. On paper, they were his biggest fans. John, Paul, George, and Ringo grew up idolizing Elvis. They sang along to his records. They watched his movies. They even admitted he was the reason they picked up guitars in the first place. But admiration has a shelf life, especially in the music industry. In 1964, the Beatles hit America like a meteor. Beatlemania was instant and overwhelming. They weren't just a popular band, they were a movement. Suddenly, all the screaming girls who once cried over Elvis were fainting for four lads from Liverpool. And Elvis noticed. At the time, he was deep into his Hollywood phase, cranking out movies, some better than others, with catchy soundtracks and packaged personas. But on stage, not much. Elvis hadn't toured in years, and the live music scene was evolving without him. When the Beatles visited him at his Los Angeles home in 1965, it should have been a dream meeting, legends colliding. Instead, it was awkward. Elvis was distant. The Beatles were nervous. They jammed a little, joked a little, but the vibe was off. Later, Ringo Starr would call it flat. John Lennon was even more blunt. He was disappointed. But the tension didn't stop at awkward small talk. John Lennon, never one to hold his tongue, started criticizing Elvis publicly, said his movies were pointless, said he'd lost the spark. For Elvis, who still took pride in everything he made, those comments hit hard, especially from someone he once inspired, and it wasn't just creative differences. The Beatles got political, loudly. They spoke out against the Vietnam War. They experimented with psychedelics. Their music became more cerebral, more radical. Elvis, by contrast, kept his image cleaner, more all-American. When he met President Nixon in 1970, he reportedly warned him that the Beatles were a bad influence, corrupting youth with drugs and rebellion. That wasn't just a PR stunt. Elvis believed it. He thought the Beatles had become symbols of chaos, and he didn't like the way they represented the new direction of pop culture. Not because they were more talented, Elvis could admit talent when he saw it, but because they had shifted the spotlight. And deep down, Elvis wasn't ready to give it up. Now let's shift to Tom Jones. Different story, but the same theme. Jones exploded onto the scene in the mid-60s with that powerhouse voice and swagger that felt eerily familiar. Tight pants, wild vocals, women throwing underwear on stage. Sound like someone you know? That's right. Elvis saw it too. At first, he admired Tom, called him a hell of a singer. But admiration turns sour when comparisons start flying. And in Vegas, comparisons were everywhere. By 1969, Elvis had returned to live performances and was dominating the Vegas Strip. It was his big comeback, but guess who else was headlining packed shows just down the road? Tom Jones. Promoters, fans, even the press started asking the question Elvis dreaded: who really ruled Vegas? Now, Elvis never publicly trashed Tom, but behind closed doors, he called him a copycat, mocked his moves, rolled his eyes at his outfits, and it didn't help that Jones was being called the voice, while Elvis was still fighting to be taken seriously as a singer, not just a showman. There's one story that says it all. At a Vegas hotel, Tom Jones was allegedly given a larger dressing room than Elvis. That might sound trivial, but for someone as image-conscious and prideful as Elvis, it was a slap in the face. He complained to management, This is Elvis Presley, after all, and demanded it be fixed, because in his mind he was the main event, not Tom, not anyone else. That's what it always came down to. Elvis didn't fear these men, he feared being replaced by them. And it wasn't ego, not entirely. It was vulnerability, insecurity, the realization that fame isn't forever, that no matter how many records you sell, there's always someone younger, fresher, hungrier waiting in the wings. For the Beatles, that threat came wrapped in British charm and global revolution. For Tom Jones, it came with a microphone, a chest full of hair, and a voice that could shake the walls. Both were talented, both were successful. But what made them usurpers in Elvis's eyes wasn't their music, it was what they represented. Time. The march of it, the fear of it, the reality that even kings grow old. And that's the tragedy behind these so-called rivalries. Elvis didn't hate these men as people. He hated what their success forced him to confront, that he wasn't invincible, that the spotlight could dim, that the throne he built could one day be someone else's stage prop. So while the headlines might talk about feuds and competition, the truth runs deeper. Elvis wasn't fighting them, he was fighting the future. When people think of Elvis Presley, they think danger, charisma, rebellion. He didn't just perform music, he shook it. But not every rival he resented was a flashy star or political voice. Some of them were soft-spoken, clean-cut, and, for Elvis, too accepted. Let's start with Pat Boone. Boone was the definition of safe. Always smiling, perfectly dressed, and approved by every conservative parent in America. He covered songs by black artists, took out the edge, and turned them into polished pop hits. It worked. He soared up the charts. But that success never sat right with Elvis. Elvis was no saint, but he had respect for the roots of the music. Blues, gospel, rhythm, and blues. He felt it. Boone? Elvis saw him as someone who copied the style without honoring the struggle behind it. Privately, Elvis called him a copycat. Someone who watered down the raw emotion in music just to make it sell. To Elvis, Boone didn't just represent a different sound, he symbolized an industry that was eager to sanitize rock and roll. That stung more than any chart battle ever could. Next up, Ricky Nelson. Now this one was quieter. No big headlines, no public fight. But the tension was real. Ricky was a teen idol, just like Elvis, good-looking, charming, and talented. But unlike Elvis, he didn't come from poverty. He didn't hustle in bars or sleep in cars. He was already famous thanks to his family's sitcom, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. So when Nelson picked up a guitar and became a pop star, Elvis saw it differently. He didn't think Ricky earned it. He thought it was handed to him. According to friends, Elvis called Ricky's music bubblegum, catchy but hollow. And while they posed for photos and smiled on the same stages, there was a quiet wall between them. It wasn't about personality. It was about privilege. Elvis came from nothing, Ricky came from television, then there was Buddy Holly. This one's bittersweet. Buddy and Elvis didn't clash in public. They weren't enemies. In fact, Buddy admired Elvis, like many young artists did. But the tension? It came from mutual respect. When Buddy opened for Elvis early in his career, he watched the King dominate the stage. But Buddy wasn't just another fan. He was a songwriter, a guitarist, a band leader. He wasn't trying to copy Elvis. He was trying to build something different. And he did. With hits like Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day, Buddy created a clean, technically brilliant sound that critics praised as more refined than Elvis's. And that got under Presley's skin. Not because he hated Holly, but because Buddy reminded him that raw charisma wasn't everything. Sometimes skill and control earned more respect. Elvis didn't openly diss Buddy, but the comparisons were there. One was the showman, the other, the craftsman. And that silent rivalry? It pushed both of them, but it also stirred quiet resentment. Tragically, Buddy died young, and any chance for deeper friendship or confrontation died with him. What ties all three of these stories together is this. Elvis wanted to be seen as a serious artist, not just a sensation, not just a scandal. And watching guys like Boone, Nelson, and Holly get respect without facing the same criticism made him feel overlooked. They had safer images, cleaner music, less backlash. But to Elvis, that wasn't a sign of talent. It was a sign that the system played favorites. He didn't just want the crowd, he wanted credibility. And for all his fame, that was the one thing he never fully got. By now, you've heard the names. Sinatra, the Beatles, Boone, Jones, they were all wrapped up in some kind of tension with Elvis Presley. But if you take a step back, a bigger question starts to form. Did Elvis really hate these people? Or was something else going on? Because here's the thing, Elvis wasn't a bitter man. He wasn't out there picking fights or trashing his rivals in public. He rarely responded to criticism, even when it hit him hard. So why all the tension? The truth is, it wasn't about them. Not really. It was about him. Elvis was a man torn in two. On one side, he had the image, the rebel, the heartthrob, the king of rock and roll. On the other side, he had deep insecurities, a need to be taken seriously, a hunger for respect that ran way deeper than album sales or screaming fans. And when other artists got that respect, especially when he didn't, it cut him down inside. Take Sinatra. Elvis didn't want to beat him. He wanted Sinatra to see him, to say, yeah, this kid's the real deal. But he never got that. Instead, he got dismissed, mocked, brushed off like a novelty act. So when they finally performed together on TV, Elvis smiled, played along, but he never forgot the sting. Same with the Beatles. They praised him, then outgrew him, took his spotlight, then criticized him from it. That's hard to swallow, especially when you know they started out as fans. And then there's the performers who played it safer, who dressed nicer, sang softer, got better press. To Elvis, they hadn't fought for it. They hadn't bled for it. And yet the world embraced them with open arms. He was adored, sure, but not always respected. And that difference haunted him. In private, Elvis would sometimes talk about feeling misunderstood, about being boxed into a role he didn't choose. He wanted to be more than a teen idol, more than a pelvis. He loved gospel. He loved country. He even covered Sinatra's My Way in the 70s, not to compete, but to say something. To show the world he had depth. That performance? It wasn't a swipe at anyone. It was a message. I did it my way. And I hope that meant something. What Elvis craved wasn't applause, it was recognition. And when that didn't come from the people he looked up to, the people who ran the industry, it turned into frustration. It turned into silence. Sometimes it turned into anger. So no, this story isn't really about hatred. It's about hurt. About a man who changed music forever and still felt like he had something to prove. Because at the end of the day, even kings want to feel worthy of their crown. When people talk about Elvis Presley, they talk about the voice, the moves, the chaos he caused just by walking into a room. They talk about the fans, the fame, the history, but they don't always talk about the weight of it all. Because being Elvis, being the king, came with a cost. He wasn't just fighting critics. He was fighting time, tradition, and the pressure of having to prove himself over and over again. Every new artist, every rising star felt like a threat to his legacy. Not because they were bad, but because they were good enough to make him question if he still mattered. That's the real story behind all these rivalries. Frank Sinatra, the Beatles, Tom Jones, Pat Boone, Buddy Holly, they weren't enemies in the dramatic, tabloid sense. They were reflections. Mirrors Elvis didn't always like looking into. Sometimes those mirrors showed him what he feared. Being forgotten, being replaced, being misunderstood. And no matter how big the spotlight, those fears never really went away. In the end, Elvis wasn't driven by hate. He was driven by a desire to be respected as an artist, not just remembered as a pop phenomenon. He wanted more than charts and headlines. He wanted validation from the people he admired most. Sometimes he got it, sometimes he didn't. But he kept performing, kept singing, kept trying to bridge the gap between fame and fulfillment. And that, more than anything, is what made Elvis Presley human. So next time you hear someone say, Elvis hated so-and-so, remember this. It wasn't always hate. Sometimes it was heartbreak dressed as pride. Now it's your turn. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories that dig beneath the legend. Thanks for watching.